Today I'm talking with Dr. John Lennox, Oxford mathematician and apologist extraordinaire. More specifically, Dr. Lennox is Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford, Emeritus Fellow in Mathematics and the Philosophy of Science at Oxford as well. He is author of several books: God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God?, Can Science Explain Everything?, and most recently, 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity. The upcoming film, Against the Tide, features Dr. Lennox's thought, and it will be showing on November 19th, 20th, and 23rd. So, Dr. Lennox, let me introduce myself. I'm a co-founder and co-director of Science for the Church. It's a nonprofit that seeks to bring the resources of science to Christian congregations for the sake of spiritual growth. Put another way, at Science for the Church, we are cultivating a stronger church through meaningful dialogue with mainstream science. I'm also a lecturer in religion, philosophy, and humanities at California State University, Chico. So welcome, Dr. Lennox.
Thank you very much indeed. Delighted to be on the air with a university colleague.
Yes. Well, and as we'll get to in a moment, another fan of the writer Clive Staples Lewis, or C.S. Lewis. So I have a subtle promo behind me for one of his books that's faced out. So Dr. Lennox, as I said in the intro, Science for the Church is particularly interested in this connection between scientists and Christian congregations or Christian life. So this is probably going to be a little bit of a longer answer, but I wonder, can you tell me about how you became a Christian? Or I believe actually you grew up in a Christian home. So when did Christian faith become, something that was your own decision, or was there a particular point that happened? How did you become a scientist, and how have those two, Christian faith and science, come together in your life?
Well, Christianity for me started with my parents, and their Christianity was credible. They lived it. And not only did they live it, it was for them an endless source of stimulation. So the way in which they presented it to me was absolutely fascinating. They encouraged me, of course, to think about the Bible and the stories and their implications, but they encouraged me to look at other worldviews as well, because they felt I needed to know what the competition was. But the wonderful thing about my parents was that they gave me space to think for myself. They didn't force Christianity down my throat. So as I grew up, I was making decisions for myself. So when I came to university in 1962 to Cambridge, I knew where I stood. And I believed that the Christian faith was true. And therefore, I made a conscious decision that I wouldn't fudge it or duck it. I would open myself to questioning, and I would defend it as best I could. And I spent my life doing that. So I owe a great debt to my parents, and the fact that they didn't try to force me into a mold, because many of my contemporaries in Northern Ireland at the time, the moment they got away from home, any semblance of Christianity disappeared, because there'd be no inner conviction about it.
Right. Wow, that sounds like the kind of environment that you could explore your faith, and that you could discover what God's truth was about it through, if you follow the metaphor, the book of nature and the book of scripture, perhaps.
That is correct, and both of those things were very important to me from the beginning. I was very interested in many things. I was very good at arithmetic at school, so they tell me. And I always found mathematics pretty easy, but there was a time when I wanted to be a linguist because I loved grammatical structure in Latin and in modern languages. And then I decided that because I'd become a ham radio operator, I wanted to do electrical engineering. But somebody, my headmaster, told me that I might have a chance to get into Cambridge if I did mathematics, and that's why I ended up doing mathematics.
Oh, wow. Well, I was impressed through the film and through reading your book, Has Science Replaced God? Can Science Explain Everything? That you know French and Russian, at least. Sounds like Latin as well. So I can see that you enjoy languages. There's probably a few more in your
Well,
bailiwick, right?
my main language is German. Actually, I
Oh,
have used German a great deal, and it's probably followed by French and then Russian and then Spanish. But I don't speak them all equally well. But
yeah,
German, I can do virtually anything in German I can do in English, and that's been extremely useful.
I'm sure.
You're in the humanities, and you'll understand that to get a glimpse into the continental mind, if you can read and speak German, it opens up an entire new world of rich literature. So I'm
Yeah,
very thankful for that.
I studied in Tübingen for a year, actually, and
Oh,
learned
did
German
you?
there. Yeah.
Well, I studied in Würzburg for a year and also in Freiburg, and then I had a
Ah.
year in Vienna.
Well, and this is a little bit of a sidebar, but there's a friend of mine, a colleague here at Cal State Chico, who's a mathematician fluent in German and just translated one of Boltzmann's papers that had never been translated before. He
Oh,
said it was,
really?
yeah,
Hmm.
it was absolutely an amazing experience. So,
Well, I did a lot of translating from Russian into English of
yes.
mathematics in earlier days.
Well, there was a question I was going to get to later, but let's do it now since we're talking about Russian. In the film, there's many, many fascinating parts. And actually, let me just give a little overview of the film just to make sure those who are listening have a sense about it. So, Against the Tide is the film. It's the story of Dr. Lennox's stand against the tide of contemporary atheism and its drive to relegate belief in God to society's catalog of dead ideas. And as we view the film, we watch you in a dialogue with the actor and director Kevin Sorbo, and you journey from Oxford, particularly The Bird and the Baby, the Eagle and the Child, where C.S. Lewis used to meet with the Inklings, to Jerusalem, to the Galilee, and then back to Oxford. So I'm going to go back to an overview of the film in a minute, an overview idea that I had as a summary, but I wanted to ask you, one of the interesting parts of the film for me was your connection. I believe it was when it was the Soviet Union and you taught in Russia, or please correct me if that's not quite right. But one of the things that was so interesting is you were concerned, I mean, deeply troubled by atheism and its effect on the Eastern Bloc. And that maybe there's a way in which today the West is moving away from our roots in Christian, faith and Christian ideas and so on, and moving toward an atheism. So, do you see us slipping away from some of those roots, and are you concerned about that?
Oh, sure. It used to be said somewhat whimsically that there's materialism in the East and materialism in the West, and the only difference is we've got the material. But certainly at the philosophical level, I think that the kind of atheism I saw demonstrated in Eastern Europe, particularly in the German Democratic Republic, and then subsequently in Russia
Mm.
and Ukraine, there's a lot of it in academia today, because in the end, there has been a rejection of the creator in the name of enlightenment and science and so on. So there is a huge danger, and it's therefore important to go against the tide, and hence the title of the film.
Yes, yes, and I would just say that this is going to. Sometimes I say this sounds like a joke. I grew up in a non-Christian home, read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, took a couple years wrestling with that as a teenager, and I went to UC Berkeley and became a Christian. So that almost sounds like a punchline, right? But I love Berkeley, but there was this assumption that if you were, a person of moderate or above intellectual capabilities, the concept of God was dead. And my own family was very influenced by the philosophy of Ayn Rand, who, was an
Mhm.
atheist and also believed basically that, belief is for the weak-minded. So I found that an interesting tie for you. And I think for those of my generation, which I'm somewhat younger than you, they may not understand that connection between, say, communism as it exists in various places like Russia and so on, and the rejection of God. So I found that really fascinating. Do you want to add anything else? I have another question about the film for you, but if there's anything else you want to say, please do.
No, not really, but I think your analysis is correct. Uh, it surprises me, of course, that if you know anything about intellectual history, this rejection of God contemporary is very superficial, because in fact it was the Judeo-Christian tradition that gave us the great universities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think of my own University of Oxford, its motto is Dominus Illuminatio Mea, the Lord is my illumination. And Harvard, Veritas,
Mm-hmm.
they have shortened their original motto. It used to be Veritas in Christo et Ecclesiae, truth in the church and in Christ.
Yeah.
And the founders of our great universities, so absolutely no conflict intellectually between the rationality of God and the rationality of the universe.
Yes.
And they explored them. So I think the contemporary rejection has all kinds of different roots that have to do with the Enlightenment, to religion gone bad in Christendom, and to the gradual rebellion intellectually against God that we've seen since then.
Yes. Well, and I think that's, for me, one of the reasons that C.S. Lewis was such an important figure. In his inaugural address at Cambridge, he talked about that, how you divide the times, right? How you divide the ages and periods of thought, and how we had moved to understanding human beings as a machine, as a way of interpreting, shall we say, the scientific revolution, and how dangerous that was and what that could result in. Go ahead. Yes, please.
Lewis was prescient, I think, and that's why some scientists hate him, because he saw through the kind of scientism that he predicted would engulf us, and it has, the idea that science is the only way to truth. And he was very clear on analyzing that science has its limits and so on.
Yes.
And that's why I found him enormously helpful, particularly because I have no idea what it's like to be an adult and not a Christian, but he did.
Yes.
And I needed a kind of guide to what it feels like to walk in an atheist's shoes and to come to wrestle with Christianity from the outside. So I've learned a massive amount from C.S. Lewis.
Well, Dr. Lennox, I would tell you that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, as you know, the full name is Clive Staples Lewis, and I have decided to canonize him as Saint Clive, just so you know. So that's my moniker.
Right. I'll second that.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to the film, but I want to make sure the segues fit really well. And this one is going to be an easy one. I had a couple of quotations that I thought you might want to respond to. This one I know you like because it's in your book, from Lewis. Men became scientific because they expected a law of nature, and they expected a law in nature because they believed in a legislator. And if I can just add to that, what I find to be a really important parallel quote, this is from Charles Townes, the Berkeley Nobel laureate. Quote, "For successful science of the type we know, we must have faith that the universe is governed by reliable laws, and further that these laws can be discovered by human inquiry." I guess this is more of just a sort of a softball pitch. Respond to those. What do they evoke for you?
Well, it may be softball, but it's extremely important, and it's hardball for a lot of people, because what that's pointing up is the faith that all scientists have to have. Now, these days, very frequently, science and faith are pitched as enemies, which is sheer nonsense, because faith is there being understood by many people as a result of Dawkins and Hitchens and so on, as believing where there's no evidence. And that's blind faith. That isn't faith. Faith comes from the Latin fides, from which we get fidelity. So it has an element of trust and reliability. And the big question that Lewis himself asked years and years ago was, how can you trust your mind to do science? Now, the rise of science, as he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. and they expected law of nature because they believed in a legislator. He was there citing Alfred North Whitehead, who was a great philosopher and historian of science, and telling us, and most historians agree with it today, that modern science is really the gift to the world of the Christian church. And Peter Harrison, who eventually became professor of science and religion at Oxford, and I know quite well now in Australia, unfortunately we lost him. He actually
a great
goes
historian,
further.
by the way. Yeah.
Yes,
Sorry to interrupt, but yeah.
he's a brilliant historian. He goes further and he points out that it wasn't only the fundamental belief in a creator, which was biblical, or the belief that the universe is contingent. God could have made it any way he liked. But another contribution was made in the 17th century by the reformers in their attitude to the interpretation of scripture. We must go and see exactly what it says and not bring a preconceived paradigm to bear on it. And Kepler's the notable example of that. So that there's a deep connection between science, modern science that is, and Christianity. And the great Nobel Prize winner you mentioned, Charles Townes, was stating exactly what's right, that here you have the grounding for doing science. Why would I bother doing science? Right. And the interesting thing about that is, and I investigate it in several of my books, is if you take the atheist view, it doesn't give you a grounding for rationality, because it tells you that you're doing science with a mind which is equal to the brain, which I reject, but if you allow it for the moment. And the brain's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I have said to many of my colleagues, some internationally famous scientists, I said, look, if you knew that the computer with which you do your calculations was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I have always received the answer no. So I say, I see you have a problem. And that's what resonates with me, that the universe is word-based. Mathematics is a language. In the beginning was the word, or the word was God. That resonates, that makes sense. The atheistic genesis of the universe makes no intellectual sense. And Lewis makes this point powerfully, that any argument that invalidates reason cannot be true because you use reason to reach it.
Right. Well, I almost put miracles up behind me, because that argument in chapter 3 of the self-defeating, naturalism is self-defeating, is such
yes,
a powerful.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And that's a very important argument today. I have been very pleased to see it revived, not only by Christians like Alvin Plantinga,
right,
but by atheists like Thomas Nagel. I mean, that is extremely interesting. There is a problem with naturalism.
Yeah. I just taught a course, I was a guest lecturer at a Duke University course on Lewis. I was working from a chapter I wrote in a book I wrote on Lewis, and discussing this question of naturalism and was it rational? And I have to say, I was very impressed with the level of engagement, and that not all of the students had imbibed the naturalistic.
Well, that's very good to hear from Duke. I'm pleased. I've been to Duke too.
Well, Dr. Lennox, I have another quotation that somehow when I thought of it, I thought of you, and it goes a little bit different direction, but I think it's complementary. This is from Eugene Wigner. The phrase is the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, right? And, it's another way of saying, why should this work? Why should math or maths work throughout the universe, throughout the cosmos? Is that another support for your belief?
That's a very important observation, and Wigner made it in a famous paper of that title in 1961. And it's a bit like Einstein's comment that the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Wigner and Einstein were clever enough to see that there's a problem here. How is it that a mathematician thinking in her mind in terms of abstract thought can come up with an equation that somehow appears to help us understand what's going out there in the universe. And of course, it's unreasonably effective if you're an atheist.
Right.
It is reasonably effective if you're a Christian like me, because the reason that mathematics works is simply this, that the same God who created the universe out there, so to speak, is ultimately responsible for creating the human mind that's understanding it. So that fits. And there again, you're right. I find these things extremely supportive. Indeed, I feel that some of the most powerful arguments against atheism don't come from the results of science so much as the fact that we can do science. And I've done a considerable amount, as you know, of trying to explore these things and make them accessible, particularly in that smaller book, Can Science Explain Everything?
Yes. Yeah. Well, by the way, I just want to put a promo out for that book because it's been used by the congregations that we work with who want to engage science and faith. And that's a great book for the layperson. I mean, this actually wasn't in my set of questions. It's on the cutting room floor, you might say, but you do such a good job of communicating to people who aren't specialists, which is really, really difficult.
That's because at heart, I'm a humanities person as well as a scientist. You see, one of the things that has really helped me in life is the fact that my mentor in my late teenage and throughout life, who became a colleague and a co-worker, was a professor of Latin and Greek. And he introduced me to the classical world. And so the humanities are as important to me as the natural sciences. And being a linguist, that fits with the mathematics because it's a specialized language. And therefore, the idea of clear explanation is very important. C.S. Lewis once said, as you probably know, I will be understood. And that has been a kind of motto for me. He also said that if a person cannot explain what they believe in words that people can understand, either they don't believe it or they don't understand it.
Right. That was, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I'm constantly looking for ways of stories that aren't arbitrary, but enable us to get a grasp on difficult concepts. Lewis was a genius at it.
Oh, he is the greatest at that I know of. I mean, he had so many great images, and I think might be referring to that essay or that lecture he gave to Anglican youth pastors, where he said if there should be an exam for every ordination. That's where you right. Translate things right into the common language. And oh boy, we could really get lost in Lewis. But I loved in the Socratic Society his response to Dr. Pittenger, where he says, I have always wanted to speak for the people, right? And I've spoken in, quote, vulgar language, to use, from the Latin.
Yes, sure.
And that means that I'm going to have to round off some edges, which is hard for academics. I've given different, presentations where I've talked to academics and said, we need to learn from Lewis because we need to communicate if we have great ideas, especially as people of Christian faith. And in addition, we have to realize there's going to be a loss because it's not going to sound as precise, but also academics like to hide sometimes behind their language. And
I fear they do. They do indeed.
And you don't do that at all. I mean, you have a boldness about you, which I think is really compelling.
A thought can be both clear and deep. And sometimes people have the impression that unless they use virtually unintelligible, high-flown language, they're not really coming across as intellectuals. And a lot of it is human pride, of course.
Yes, yeah.
Lewis wanted to speak clearly and to articulate profound ideas at levels that people could grasp part of them. And that really is a goal. Yeah. And he's a model for me in that way.
Well, and that really came out of his Christian faith, it seems to me as I've read his biographies when he was doing his lectures for the RAF, the Royal Air Force, he had to speak to people that weren't his Oxford undergrads, right? And he
That's
learned what
correct.
they do. He studied what they thought about words, which is really fascinating, I think. I have so here's I was asked to do an endorsement for Against the Tide, again, which is opening on or showing November 19th, 20th, and 23rd. And so here's what I wrote about Against the Tide. I want to see if you think this is accurate and does it work for you. Against the Tide movingly presents the profound and provocative ideas of Oxford mathematician John Lennox and why it's irrational to conclude that science disproves God. Does that work for you, and how would you respond?
Well, I believe that's true. So it works for me. I think that's a fairly objective statement about the film, and that is the whole purpose. And I want to step into the public space and give people something to think about, because we get so much of the other stuff, and it's not politically correct to go in the direction that I go very often. So I just feel it's extremely important to articulate these things in the name of free speech and what universities stand for.
Yes, yes. It's interesting. I'm musing about something. I teach a class on science and religion at least twice a year here at Cal State Chico, and there are about 100 students throughout the year that do this. And I do an exercise where I have a video that they watch from Richard Dawkins, Why I Am a Militant Atheist. It's his TED Talk, and Francis Collins's talk about the language of God. And I have the students evaluate these two talks. And I say, which one was more rational? Who proved their case better? And it's interesting. This is a state university. I can tell you that about 45%, according to the surveys I've taken of hundreds of students, about 45% say they're Christian. So it's not predominantly Christian, but plurality of Christians. Still, many are not Christian believers. The majority of people, however, in my class will say that Collins, as a Christian, made more sense than Dawkins, that his arguments were better, and that they were convinced that he talked about faith, about science, and that the science was supportive of his faith. So maybe I'll have to just throw in one of your lectures as well and do the same exercise, but I think it'll come out the same way. And I say that as a test, like now I've done this with probably 500-600 students, and it's fascinating to me, and I think you do a really amazing job of this. When you present the Christian faith with boldness, with clarity, it is its own authenticator, and
I think that's very important. And talking about your class, why don't you throw in the debate between me and Dawkins, so that gives them both sides at once?
I like that. That's good.
That's been used all around the world at universities, schools, and colleges, because it's a public debate, and it's very good to encourage critical thought, because that's what you're after. Get them to analyze the arguments and what's weak in Lennox's view, what weak in Dawkins' view, and strong, and vice versa. These are very good pedagogical methods, I think.
Well, and this is a bit of a context for the United States, but we're losing an ability to actually evaluate arguments well. And to really
hugely so. It's not only in the US.
Yes.
We are not teaching people to think at school level, and it starts at home, of course. Where people are amusing themselves to death, as the title of the book once went, and they're glued to tablets and they're rewiring their brains.
Yeah.
And they're incapable of following rational arguments that are more than 140 characters long.
Sadly, you're right. I agree with you. Wow. Yeah. I mean, there's so much there. And I appreciate, again, the robust way in which you approach your presentation. So I had a couple questions related to that. The first one is, you have gone up against the most famous atheists, Hitchens and Dawkins, to name two of them. And there have been a couple times where I've been in environments where I was clearly had antagonism toward what I was saying. So this is a little bit of, actually, this is not true of Chico State. Those environments have been actually quite good, but other environments. And maybe this is just a question that you could help with. How do you prepare for those debates? And do they make you nervous? Do you have to work through your nerves? Or anyway, how do you prepare for them? How does it feel to?
Well, those are two separate questions.
Mm-hmm.
The confrontational style debate that I had with Dawkins and twice and Hitchens twice demand enormous amount of work. I mean, in terms of months. I spent hundreds of hours preparing because the idea of giving a little speech and then they come back on that and you have to respond to that and then you have to sum up. That's why none of us want to do them anymore, because to do it properly involves so much time input. What if he says X and so on?
Yes.
So it required an enormous amount of work. Now, the question of nerves is an interesting one, because it seems to me there are two kinds of fear that beset people in these kinds of environment. There's a good kind and there's a less good kind. The less good kind is fear of what people are going to think of me. And that comes with our old human pride, and we're all tarred with that. But there's a second nervousness, and that is, here are these people coming out in their hundreds, maybe their thousands, and I'm defending the Christian gospel.
Mm-hmm.
There's that nervousness. Am I wasting their time? Am I doing a good job? And that's why I was so grateful to have had thousands of people praying for me at the time. And I think we need to break through the first kind of nervousness, but never to lose the second. Woe betide folks when they say, I don't care what people think. You need to care what people think because you're trying to communicate with them. But you shouldn't care so much what they think of you. That's a different matter.
Right.
So that is just a very rough response to this, but they are very formidable experiences. I'd never done anything like it before I met Dawkins in Alabama. I'd never done anything like that before.
Do you, I mean, embedded in what you just said is this sense of, I guess, humility and stewardship of the Christian message. And do you feel, I mean, is prayer part of your preparation?
Oh, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned earlier the people who were praying, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't go to win the debate. That's the motivation.
Mm-hmm.
What I go to do, and I was advised to do this by a very senior person in the newspaper industry, a writer, a brilliant writer who's very well known. And he said, make sure, whatever you say, that you get your message across so that the people, the audience, understands what you stand for. And that's enormously important because you can very easily react, so to speak, a knee-jerk reaction to what the other person is saying and lose the plot entirely. The other thing is, don't get angry and be as friendly as possible. I try as far as possible to befriend people. And sometimes that's very successful. And people who've been very hostile to me at the beginning of a debate have ended up chatting amiably and being friendly because they realize that I'm not against them, so to speak. I am against their ideas, but not against them. Yeah. And somehow we've got to communicate that. Well, this is, of course, the basic teaching of the Christian Gospels, how our Lord and his apostles behaved.
Well, and that is a great segue to another one of my final questions I want to ask. And I want to thank you for your time, Dr. Lennox, and thank you for this film, Against the Tide, which is coming out. In the film, it's clear, and in your life, it's clear that you don't want to just talk about a generic God or the God of the mathematics, but you want to talk about the God we know in Jesus Christ. So I'm particularly interested about the resurrection. I was part of a panel for the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Washington, D.C. about science and Christianity. And I was on a panel, and we were given a question from the audience, which was, in the scientific world, it makes no sense to believe in a resurrection. You cannot accept science and believe in the resurrection, which is the center of your faith as a Christian. What do you say to that? And so I have my answers, and I'd love for the people who are listening or watching or reading about this to hear your answer. How, as a scientist, do you believe and can you believe in the resurrection of Christ?
This objection really is often traced back to David Hume, and who said miracles are violations of the laws of nature. And roughly speaking, we know the laws of nature through the natural sciences, so miracles are out. And that's a confusion of thought. And again, Lewis's book on miracles is extremely helpful. There's one analogy in it that I use all the time, and I find it simple enough that even professors can understand it. And that is, if I stay in a hotel tonight and put $100 in the drawer by my bed, do the same tomorrow night, that's $200, but wake up on the next morning and find only $50, do I conclude that the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or the laws of California have been broken? And the point is, I conclude that the laws of California have been broken because I know that the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. You see. And that's the very important thing. The confusion arises as to what we mean by the word law. On the sidewalk in many American cities, you'll see violators will be towed. And that is not the idea when it comes to a law of nature. What are the laws of nature? They are our descriptions of what normally happens. So Newton's law of gravity will say that a dropped apple will fall towards the center of the earth, but that doesn't prevent you catching it in midair and stopping it hitting the ground. And you see, if I was claiming as a Christian that Jesus rose from the dead by some natural process going on in the grave, then it would break laws of nature. But I'm not claiming that at all. I'm claiming that God, the Creator, who built the regularities into the universe that we describe by the laws of nature in the first place, he can feed an event into the system. And you see, there's nothing in science that can prevent that. The real problem behind this is the common view that this universe is a closed system of cause and effect. Well, that was my false belief in connection with my hotel bedroom and the drawer. I thought it was a closed system, but it wasn't. A thief was able to get in and put his hand in and take $150. And that analogy can help us to understand that you cannot argue against miracle in principle. Science doesn't stop miracles happening. But then you have to go to the other side, because I'm not going to accept every claim for a supernatural event, statues weeping and all this kind of stuff. So we need now to have a look at the positive evidence for the resurrection. Are there grounds to believe that it actually happened? And interestingly enough, in the last 2 chapters of my book, Can Science Explain Everything?, I took David Hume on, both at the level of what I've just told you about miracles being violations of the laws of nature, but also in his discussion of criteria for valid witnesses, which is a very interesting way of approaching it. So those last 2 chapters of that book are really my attempt to encapsulate how I would go about talking about the resurrection. And in the film, Kevin Sorbo and I visit the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem, which is not the place where Jesus was buried, but it's like it, and it gives the atmosphere and the idea. And we discuss all of these issues there as far as one can in a film. Yeah. By the way, your listeners should know I'm writing a book, a guide to accompany the film, to take things deeper that clearly you cannot deal with in depth in a documentary film style.
Yeah. When will that be out, Dr. Lennox?
as soon as we can get it out. I have it
Yeah.
more or less written.
That's great. Yes. Well, I love the places that you're at, and I thankfully have been able to go to Jerusalem twice. And I remember a really moving communion service at the Garden Tomb that you're talking
Yes,
about.
that's right.
Yeah, and it was really, really beautiful. And that you, in a way, reenacts what a burial would have been like, and therefore what the resurrection itself would be like. Well, I've taken the time that we've talked about, and I'm really thankful for that. I don't know if there's something that you want to say before we wrap up. One question I would love to ask as a final question for me is, we are very interested in the public engagement of science, or the engagement of science with the church, both locally and globally. Is there any side to that that you would like to address? Like, we believe, and this is something we found actually statistically, that when congregations engage with science, they actually grow not just in their understanding of science, but they grow spiritually all across the board. So that's really important to us. And do you have any particular message about the engagement of science with local congregations?
A survey was done in England asking why people were leaving the church. The number one answer was they don't answer our questions. And I think it's vastly important for churches to engage with the questions, not only the questions about science, but the questions arising from our culture, and taking them seriously. Now, many pastors have a good education, but it doesn't cover everything. And I encourage pastors to use members of their congregation, get them involved, get people into a public dialogue. And I often, you see, instead of giving a sermon, I simply stand up with a piece of paper and said, what are your questions? People are full of questions, and we ought to do much more of communication by dialogue. This is why I enjoy doing the kind of thing we're doing just now, because it communicates in an idiom that's far more powerful than simply one talking head.
And that would include getting scientists from a congregation up before.
That would insist on doing that. Get people who are experts and encourage them, because it can get them going.
Yeah.
I do not agree with this idea that the pastor does all the talking in the church. I do a lot of exposition of scripture. It's my chief love. We need to use all our gifts, and therefore churches need to provide an arena for all the gifted members of the congregation. And that may mean allowing scientists to preach and humanities professors to preach and so on. It enriches the situation enormously, and it's much more credible.
Well, I remember I remember my experience as a pastor in New York City when Redeemer Church was exploding. And Tim Keller used to finish his sermons by having a question and answer. And that was the way he got New Yorkers to engage with him, in a very real way.
That's the way to do it. But I would also want to say to congregations that the great weakness that I detect is individuals, fear and shame, not being able to break the barrier of what if they ask me a question I can't answer. And if you don't mind me mentioning it, I've also written a little book called Have No Fear. It's a very short book out of my own experience, the things that I believe can be said to people to get them through that fear barrier and equip them to be able to give an answer to anybody that asks them a reason concerning the hope that is within them. Many people do not realize the obvious, that statement by the Apostle Peter has nothing to do with preaching. Always be ready to give an answer to someone that asks you. That's one-to-one conversation. And that's what the churches ought to be encouraging. People find out what the questions are that their friends have, spend time researching answers, and then one after the other, they learn how to deal with these questions. There's no use encouraging people to read a vast book on apologetics because they won't remember anything, because it's not real questions coming from their own life's experience.
I mean, that
But there
ability
we
and
are.
go ahead. I was
No,
going
no,
to say
that's it.
the ability and willingness to answer questions was, for me, it was really powerful as a university student in coming to know
Oh,
the truth
that's
of the
right.
gospel. I mean, that was
Yes,
critical for me.
it is. It's critical, and people must learn that if they can't answer questions, and they're going to come across questions they can't answer, they should honestly say so.
Right.
Christians are not defined by saying they are those who can answer every question. People need to see that we're vulnerable and we're human.
Mhm.
And if we do that and say to folks, look, I don't even really grasp your question, but I'd love to think about it. Why don't we meet for coffee next week and discuss it? That's a much better way forward. Let's be real rather than pretending to knowledge that we don't have.
Mm. That seems like a great place to end. So is it okay if I just say thank you, Dr. John Lennox, Oxford mathematician and apologist extraordinaire?
Thank you very much. It's been a sheer delight to talk with you.
Well, all the best, and I hope this film is seen by many, many people and they get a chance to encounter, obviously, your ideas, but also the ideas of the gospel.